These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Think back to Morphy's mate. It involved pressure against h8 from a bishop coupled with pressure down an open g-file from a heavy piece. The role of the heavy piece in that sequence also can be filled by a knight on h6, thus black is mated in the diagram by white's knight just as he would be by a white rook on g3. Since our goal is not only to see the mating patterns in final form but also to understand the moves that lead to them, reflect for a moment on how the knight could have gotten to h6. It had to come from on f5 or g4, which is one reason why those are considered strong squares for a knight. White to move. What is the best move? The identical mate can arise when the knight lands on e7, as pictured here. Again, the important thing to see is the number of ways the knight can get there, from f5, again, from d5, or a little less commonly from g6 or c6 or even c8, all the squares that are spotted, and we also have put a spot on g4, since it allows knight moves to h6, checkmate. As shown a moment ago. A knight sitting on any of those spotted squares has the potential to mate in one move if the bishop's side of Morphy's mate is in place. Its actual ability to mate naturally will depend on whether and how well those squares are protected, etc. Black to move. What is the best move? There is more. Suppose your knight instead lands on f6, as pictured here. This is check, but not mate. Black can move his king to h8 or g7. But then when white moves his knight he will unmask a discovered check by his bishop. If you have read the section on discovered attacks, you understand how potent a discovered check can be. In effect, it gives the knight a free move because black has to spend his time saving his king. Even in this skeletal position where few targets are visible, white thus would have knight moves to d7, check. Attacking black's rook and then taking it, and winning the exchange, after black moves his king out of check. So f6 is another powerful square for the knight, and it can get there from e4 or h5 or d7, 3 more squares on which we have added spots. You can see where all this leads. If the enemy king is on g8, it's natural castling square, and your dark squared bishop has a clear shot against h8, your knight can make terrible trouble by adding a check, and it can do this from almost any light-colored square on black's half of the board. The f5 square often is the knight's most useful jumping off point, but again your best actual options will depend on other features of the position, such as how black has defended those checking squares h6, f6, and e7. The important thing to realize is how powerful a knight can become once you have control over the long dark diagonal. The beauty of the knight is that its power doesn't depend on whether any of the files leading to the king are open, thus the ideas described in these last three positions may be just as effective if black has a pawn cluttering the g file, which would be enough to frustrate a rook. White to move. What is the best move? Before using these ideas, the usual sacrifices may be needed to open the long diagonal for the bishop or queen, to create a safe square for the knight, or both. Here you should see that white has a bishop on the long diagonal and a knight on f5, with the knight ready in principle to support mate from e7 or h6 if the diagonal can be opened. Hone in on the impediment, the pawn on g7. The best way to clear a pawn is to take something it protects or to make a threat from a square it guards, forcing it to capture and leave its line. So white plays the mate threat, queen moves to h6. Black is forced to reply, pawn from g7 takes queen to avoid queen takes at g7, checkmate. Yet this opens the diagonal and allows white to mate with knight takes at h6, not knight moves to e7, since then black has knight takes knight. Queen moves to h6 is a classic technique for creating an open diagonal to permit a mate of this type. White to move. What is the best move? Of course, you should not imagine that the knight always is the piece that swoops in to deliver the coup de grace. The knight can be in place on h6 or e7 from the start of the sequence, with work then needed only to open the long diagonal or get a queen or bishop onto it. In this case, white has a knight on e7, a strong position because it seals off g8 to black's king. And black's g-pawn has advanced a square, leaving the long diagonal open, so the only element missing for mate is a bishop or queen there. Now identify the impediment to moving the queen to the diagonal where you want it. The pawn on g6 blocks its path. White therefore plays rook moves to h5, putting a piece and prize to the pawn with a mate threat. Queen takes at h7, checkmate. It forces black to play pawn from g6 takes rook, moving his pawn off the 6th rank. Now white mates with queen moves to f6. While the earlier examples involved the king on g8, you can see that it may not matter if the enemy king is on h8 or g8 or g7 so long as it is confined to those squares and you have them covered, the dark squares by a diagonal piece, and the light square by your knight. This is a good moment for a reminder that the colors of the squares get reversed if you are playing with the black pieces, but the logic remains the same. The bishop covers the squares leading to the king's corner, and the knight covers the square of the other color. Black to move. What is the best move? The knight also can fill the role played by a bishop in Morphy's mate. Here white has the black king trapped in the corner by his rook, which drives down the open g-file. The rook seals off the king's only flight squares. Any pressure against the king's position on h8 thus will create checkmate. A bishop on the long diagonal could provide that pressure, but so can a knight stationed on f7. This particular pattern is a little less common because the knight has less flexibility. It has to be on f7, because that is the only square from which it can attack h8 without blocking the g-file. But we will see other uses of this general principle in due course as when we study the Arabian mate, which is based on a related idea. White to move. What is the best move? The black king's position looks well fortified, but white's pieces are arranged powerfully enough to force mate in 3 moves. His knight is on g4, a great square since it allows knight moves to h6 or knight moves to f6, both of which are brutal attacking moves. He has 2 attackers that can use the long dark diagonal, his queen and his dark squared bishop. The g7 pawn is what holds black's position together. It blocks the dark diagonal and protects f6 and h6 against occupation by white's knight. Put these factors together and they should suggest a classic bishop and knight mate, made possible by a queen sacrifice to open g7, one queen takes at g7, check. King takes queen, 2. Bishop moves to f6, check. King moves to g8, 3. Knight moves to h6, checkmate. Notice these additional virtues of a knight on g4, not only that it can jump to h6 and f6, but that it can protect a bishop as it arrives on one of those squares as well, while sealing off the other as a flight square. And notice as well the crucial work done by the pawn on h5. Without it, black's second move is king moves to g6 and the immediate threat is over. The offensive power of a pawn advanced past the fourth rank should not be underestimated. Such pawns can provoke your opponent into captures that create valuable open lines. They can support attacks by pieces on the squares they protect, they can deny your opponent squares where he would like to place defenders, and they can seal off important flight squares for the enemy king. Presumably you realize that if black's g7 pawn instead were on g6 at the start of this position, white would mate immediately with knight moves to h6. But if you instead imagine the h7 pawn on h6 at the start, the sequence no longer works. Black's second move is king moves to h7 and again his king escapes. The lesson is to be careful not to use mating patterns, or any patterns, mechanically. They are meant to suggest ideas, but you still have to test the idea as it will play out in your position. These mates that involve trapping the king on squares in the corner are a good example, as they depend on the king's limited range of motion. If it has flight squares, all of them must be accounted for. White to move. What is the best move? White's queen is en prize to the knight on c6, but of course we avoid reflexive resort to defensive play. Look for an attack, study the enemy king and its vulnerabilities. The long diagonal leading to black's king is open, this is an opportunity that must be inspected closely. White has control over the diagonal with his queen, and his dark squared bishop is available as well. This also was true in the previous problem. It is important to notice when you have more firepower than you need for such a purpose, as that means you can sacrifice some of it. White would mate if he were able to move his knight to e7 safely, but the square is defended. So he plays with another knight check, one knight moves to f6, check. It forces the king to h8 or g7. Now when white moves the knight he will discover check. Black has no loose pieces that would make good targets for the knight, but still, keep looking for mate. Here that means putting the knight where it can stay involved by attacking black's weak dark squares. White thus plays 2. Knight moves to g4, check. Doesn't this allow black to extinguish the check with knight takes queen? Yes, but now white has 3. Bishop moves to f6, check. Protected against king takes bishop by the knight now on g4. The king is forced back to g8, and then white plays 4. Knight moves to h6, checkmate. The knight's 3 moves here are worth some study, they illustrate the comfort with the piece you want to attain. Indeed, notice that the whole mate is built with bishop and knight moves. The queen, which looks like the dominant piece at the beginning, never moves and serves just to deliver a discovered check before white lets it get taken. Incidentally, another way the sequence can go is 1. Knight moves to f6, check. King moves to h8, 2. Knight moves to g4, check. Pawn from f7 moves to f6, 3. Bishop takes at f6, check. Rook takes bishop, 4. Queen takes rook, checkmate. The bishop on c4 seals off g8 as a flight square, for by the end of the sequence the knight on d5 and the pawn on f7 both are out of the way. White to move. What is the best move? Black has moved his bishop back to g7, forcing the question of the white queen's intentions. Should the queen retreat? The prospects for mate might seem remote. The bishop blocks the long diagonal to h8, the files leading to black's king are closed, and white has no knight able to give check. But the white bishop aimed down the long diagonal from b2 still is provocative, especially when white has his own knight on the same diagonal on d4. This formation is the kernel of a discovery, and it allows white to inflict a double check if he can get black's king onto g7. That result is easy enough to arrange. You just have to be open to the idea of a queen sacrifice. One queen takes bishop, check. King takes queen, 2. Knight moves to f5, check. Plus, king moves to g8, 3. Knight moves to h6, checkmate. The position works the same way if white's queen starts on e5. The point still is to get the king onto g7 with a sacrifice, and then to move the d4 knight to h6 in 2 steps, the first of which is a double check that gives black no option but to move his king. Notice that there needs to be a black pawn on g6 so that after the double check the king can't move there. The knight itself seals off h6. You needn't remember these particular details, but you do need to remember to account for all flight squares. These last 2 examples both have shown how a knight can spend multiple moves getting into position to mate with a bishop. The key in both cases is a clever use of discovered check, playing with ways the knight can jump on or off the long diagonal on its way to the mating square. Both positions also involve sacrifices of queens to attain the desired pattern. Once you determine that a mate is nearby using pieces other than the queen, a queen sacrifice to take out the obstacles to it should not faze you. White to move. What is the best move? White's bishop has a clean line to h8, which is half of a mating idea. Completing it would require getting a heavy piece onto h8, using a heavy piece to put pressure down the g-file, or attacking the king with a knight. Since all the files leading to black's king are closed and white has no apparent way to open any of them with sacrifices, think about the knight. You can move it to e7 in 2 steps, knight moves to d5, then knight moves to e7. And then see that moving the knight off of c3 would also unmask the discovered attack queen takes queen. Or you might have started by seeing the kernel of a discovery for white, then looked to see what the knight could do once it left c3, and realized it could threaten to execute a classic knight and bishop mate by leaping to e7. The point either way is the same. After white plays knight moves to d5, black has to take some measure to prevent white from mating next move with knight moves to e7. After he does so, say, with pawn from c6 takes knight, he loses his queen to queen takes queen. This is yet another case of using a discovered attack to buy 2 moves to get a knight into mating position, though this time the likely result is a gain of material rather than mate. This often is how mating threats function. You may not carry them out, but they force your opponent to make sacrifices to stop you. The position also is a reminder that even a knight far away from the action must not be overlooked as a resource. This is an extreme case, but it shows that even from c3 a knight still may be only a move away from threatening to mate the castled black king. White to move. What is the best move? Two features of this position should jump out at you: the pin of white's queen on the b-file and the kernel of a discovery for white along the g-file. Black has a discovery prepared on the 4th rank, too, but it won't be our focus. White has no target for the g1 rook once it is unmasked, but with the king on an adjacent file the question is not whether you can win material, it is whether you can threaten or achieve mate. White considers the check, knight moves to f7 and notices that the rook then seals off g7 and g8 as flight squares, and that the bishop on d3 seals off h7. Indeed, knight moves to f7 would be mate were it not for the protection supplied to the square by black's rook on b7. So white plays 1. Queen takes rook, which removes the guard of f7 and incidentally extinguishes the pin of his queen. Now if black plays bishop takes queen, white mates with 2. Knight moves to f7. You can view this position just as a way to win a rook, since black dares not recapture white's queen. That is the main thing to see in this position. But as an exercise it may be instructive to spend a couple of frames pushing this one farther. Find black's best alternative response and see where it leads. White's mating threat depends on 3 players, his knight, rook, and bishop. Black looks to derail one of those pieces, and so plays 1. Knight moves to f5, interposing his knight in front of the bishop and thus allowing his king a flight square on h7. Now white, working strictly with checks, plays 2. Queen takes bishop, check, which forces black's king to g7. We then come to the position in the next diagram. White to move. What is the best move? Now what? Notice that white still has the kernel of a discovery on the g-file. He can take advantage of it with the double check knight takes at e6. The king can move to h6, h7, or f7. Consider each possibility. A. If the king goes to h6, white mates immediately with queen moves to h8, his queen attacks the king on the h-file and his rook seals off the g-file. B. If the king goes to h7, white can bring in still another piece with check, bishop takes knight, check. Since the pawn on e6 is off the board, the bishop can't be captured, and black has nothing to interpose. So black has to move his king again, this time to h6. Now queen moves to h8 again, mates. See, if black's reply to knight takes at e6, check. His king moves to f7, white then plays queen moves to d7, check. Black is forced to interpose his knight on e7, his king has no flight squares, each square the king can reach on the back rank is attacked by a different white piece. Now white mates with rook moves to g7, as shown in the next diagram, the last of the sequence. Black to move. What is the best move? This illustrates the outcome of variation, C, just described. Black is mated. These variations we have been considering are a detour from our study of classic mating patterns, but they are too valuable to pass up as studies in the art of hunting down a king in open territory with checks that finally leave it nowhere to run. Variation, B, shows the value of remembering to summon other pieces into the hunt, white's bishop, where you can do so without a loss of time. All three variations, but especially, B, and, C, also are good exercises in keeping track of the ways that a king's flight squares can be eliminated by different pieces working together. Black to move. What is the best move? The knight as a substitute in Greco's pattern. The previous section showed how the mating idea we associate with Morphy or Pillsbury, the use of a bishop on the long dark diagonal, plus another piece to seal off g8, can be achieved using a knight as the second piece rather than a rook or queen. The same is true of Greco's mate. You will recall that Greco's idea was to direct a bishop against g8 and then seal off the h-file with a heavy piece. Again, a knight sometimes can do the work of the heavy pieces, as the diagram here shows, and in at least one sense it can do the work better. Greco's mate depended on an obstruction at f8, or a white rook on the f-file, to prevent the king from slipping away along the back rank. But if you have a knight posted on g6, as white does here, it eliminates f8 as well as h8 as flight squares for the enemy king. White to move. What is the best move? The important thing is to see not just how a mate looks when it is finished but how it can look when it is a move or two away. The tip-off here is the absence of black's f-pawn. Anytime a pawn in front of the king is absent, either because it has advanced, changed files, or left the board entirely, think about ways to take advantage. The classic way to exploit a missing f-pawn is to get a bishop or queen aimed down the diagonal toward g8, and then to add pressure against h8 with a heavy piece or with a knight. Here white has a knight available for the task. He sees that Greco's old-fashioned mate can't be created because he would have to sacrifice his rook to open the h-file and then would have no heavy piece left to put there. But his rook does pin the h7 pawn, which means white can land his knight on g6, and his bishop has a clear path to the diagonal with bishop moves to c4. So white works with checks, one knight moves to g6, check. King moves to g8, 2. Bishop moves to c4, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? To repeat, the idea for a mate is there because black's f-pawn is missing. White therefore plays with ways to put pressure down the diagonal to g8 and then mate with vertical pressure against h8. Again he only has one heavy piece and so won't be able to execute Greco's mate in traditional form, but if white were able to get his knight safely to g6 he could mate with his bishop from d5. At present the g6 square is guarded by the pawn on h7 and d5 is guarded by black's knight, but now white sees a way his queen can be useful, he plays queen takes at h7, check. Almost mating, with support from the f8 knight, except that black can play knight takes queen, king takes queen is not possible, of course. So white lets him play that, then safely swings his knight into position with knight moves to g6, check. Black's king is forced to g8, and now bishop moves to d5, checkmate. Concludes the matter. Step back from the position and see the ideas in it, spotting the missing f-pawn and the resulting line to g8, moving the knight and bishop pair from their current positions onto g6 and d5 respectively, and using a queen sacrifice to loosen both of those squares, and also to get the queen out of the bishop's way. White to move. What is the best move? There are some conditions necessary before our current mating idea can work. Black can't have any good interpositions on the diagonal leading to g8, and his king can't have h7 available as a flight square. In this position white's knight is enormously well placed on a hole created by black's advances of his f-pawn and h-pawn. The advanced f-pawn also suggests the possibility of mate using a bishop directed at f8. White can play bishop moves to c4, check. Easily enough, but now must consider the issues just mentioned. Can black interpose his rook from e8? Not effectively. If he plays rook moves to e6, the rook is loose and just gets taken with bishop takes rook, check. Renewing the threat. If black's rook were on f8 and able to interpose at f7, white's mating threat would fail, though he still could win material. But now what about h7? It's open as a flight square for black's king, but notice that white has a queen aimed at the square. So if black plays king moves to h7, white can discover check by moving his knight. How to capitalize? Like so, one bishop moves to c4, check. Rook moves to e6, 2. Bishop takes rook, check. King moves to h7, 3. Knight moves to f8, check. Plus, king moves to h8, queen moves to h7, checkmate. The double check by the knight forces black's king to move, and then the knight provides cover for white's queen on the mating square, h7. The larger point, the open h7 square, meant that an additional piece was needed to execute the mate. White to move. What is the best move? A difficulty in using our current mating pattern is that if black has a pawn on h7, then g6 probably isn't safe for your knight, but if black doesn't have a pawn on h7, then his king can move there and perhaps escape the mate. We have seen three ways to deal with this: make a sacrifice on h7 that causes the pawn to be replaced by a piece that can't defend g6, pin the pawn with a rook, or, if the pawn has been moved forward, set up an attack against h7 with another piece so that you will have a discovered check if the enemy king moves there. Here is a final method. You see that white controls g8 with his bishop, so your thoughts turn to ways of pressuring h8. The natural idea is knight takes knight, check. Which would work, except that black has a pawn on h7 and so can reply pawn from h7 takes knight. Well, but what if he does? The capture leaves open black's end of the h-file, so white will mate if he can rush a heavy piece there, and he can, with queen moves to h3, checkmate. Greco's mate after all. Thus the pattern of the current mate is used to pry open the h-file, which turns out to have other happy consequences. White to move. What is the best move? With black's f-pawn out of the way, white looks for methods of getting pressure against g8. His bishop is aimed that way, and is blocked only by his own knight. This is good news, for it means white has the kernel of a discovery on the needed diagonal. Perhaps as the knight leaps out of the way, it also can provide pressure against h8 and complete the mate. The g6 square is loose, so the idea looks promising. White just needs a way to get his knight to g6 in 2 moves that hold the initiative. The surest way to control the position is with a double check, knight moves to e7, check. Plus. In reply to a double check there is no choice but to move the king, so king moves to h8 is forced on black. Now knight takes at g6 mates. This position resembles some of those in the previous section, a bishop on the diagonal ready to contribute to mate, and masked by a friendly knight that can complete the pattern if properly positioned. It's a powerful configuration if you can manage it. Black to move. What is the best move? Anastasia's mate. You might think of Anastasia's mate as yet another variation on the principle of Greco's mate, except this time your knight takes the place of the bishop that attacks g8, not of the heavy piece on the h-file. Thus in the diagram black is mated by white's rook, since g6 and g8 are sealed off as flight squares by white's knight. Notice that the mate would work just as well if black still had a pawn on f7, since the work conventionally done by a bishop instead is being done by a knight. No open line through f7 is necessary. The spots show not only the squares the knight attacks, but also the squares from which the knight can reach the critical e7 square. The f5 and d5 squares are especially common launching pads for this mate, which is another reason why they are powerful outposts for a knight. Black to move. What is the best move? The typical form of Anastasia's mate is the pattern just seen, where a rook administers mate down the h-file. But the motif also can be turned on its side as shown here, with the knight closing off f7 and h7 or any comparable squares in front of the king, trapping it on the back rank. The rook's attack from b8 ends up functioning like a familiar back rank mate. Black to move. What is the best move? Most mating patterns have a signature move or idea, a distinctive attacking position for one of your pieces, the potential for which can serve as a clue that the pattern may be available. For Anastasia's mate, the signature is the knight's move to e7, or, if the knight is black, to e2, against the castled king. The move forces the king over to h8, and seals off both g8 and g6, it means the king is trapped on the h-file, so that an attack there by a heavy piece will deliver mate perhaps after a sacrifice to open h7, or h2 for black. In the diagrammed position, black sees that his knight can get to e2, that his queen then will be able to get to h2, and be sacrificed there, and that his rook then will be able to reach the h-file to close the deal. So he plays 1. Knight moves to e2, check. 2. King moves to h1, forced, queen takes at h2, check. Standard, 3. King takes queen, forced, rook moves to h4, checkmate. The potential queen and rook moves both were masked by the knight at the outset, but when a knight is posted this powerfully, you always want to ask what effect its moves would have on the lines where it sits. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's knight is on the mighty d4 square, mighty in part because from there the knight can jump to e2, checking white's king and forcing it into the corner where it may be subject to Anastasia's mate. Black considers whether he can open the h-file and put a heavy piece on it to complete the pattern. White's pawn on h3 is the troublemaker, it protects the knight at g4, however, so black can play queen takes knight to draw the pawn out of the way. But now he must worry about how to get a rook to the h-file. After white's recapture, his pawn left on g4 would guard h5 against occupation by one rook and block the path to the h-file of the other one. Yet those 2 points taken together suggest a solution for black. He goes ahead with rook moves to h5, check. Always working with checks where he can, inviting pawn from g4 takes rook, this time clearing a pawn by launching a threat from a square it protects. Now the way is clear for black's other rook to go to h4 and mate. To summarize the sequence: 1. Knight moves to e2, check. 2. King moves to h1, queen takes knight, 3. Pawn from h3 takes queen, rook moves to h5, check. 4. Pawn from g4 takes rook, rook moves to h4, checkmate. This is one of those ideas that is important not because black is likely to carry it out but because the threat of it will force white to cough up material. For example, as soon as black's knight moves to e2, white can take it with his queen, but then the queen is lost to rook takes queen. Or white can permit knight moves to e2 but then respond to black's second move queen takes knight by letting go of the knight and keeping the h-file clogged with a pawn. Thus white could reply to 2. Black queen takes knight with 3. Queen takes at d6, or white might play the pawn fork 3. Pawn from f2 moves to f3. In response to this last threat, black would have 3. Black knight moves to g3, check. Looking first for his checks, since they hold the initiative and prevent white from carrying out the fork, 4. King moves to g1, knight takes rook f1. However, white recaptures, black has made gains and threatens knight takes queen if white tries to make good on the pawn fork. White can move his queen away, yet black has good replies then, too, but now we're getting into complications beyond the scope of this little study. The general point is that black gains the upper hand one way or another by putting the mating sequence into motion, even if he doesn't actually get to execute it. Black to move. What is the best move? Black sizes up his offensive options and finds two main resources. His knight can reach e2, and he has connected rooks on the 8th rank that can be brought to the h-file in succession, Damiano's Q, as we have been naming it, with a queen nearby as well. So here, as in the previous case, he starts with 1. Knight moves to e2, check. Forcing 2. King moves to h1. Next comes a standard sacrifice to open h2 and then the follow-up with another heavy piece, 2, rook takes at h2, check. 3. King takes rook, rook moves to h8, check. And now black's only concern is white's interpositions. White can play queen moves to h6 or bishop moves to h6, and either way the interposed piece has protection, but either way it doesn't matter since black's queen attacks h6 as well. One possibility is 4. Queen moves to h6, rook takes queen, check. 5. Bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, checkmate. Another is 4. Bishop moves to h6, which leads even more quickly to queen moves to h4, checkmate. The resemblance to Greco's pattern is that mate gets administered by a heavy piece on the h-file because the king can't move to g8, or g1. But if you imagine the f2 pawn off the board and a black bishop on d4 instead of a knight, you can see that the knight actually has some advantages over a bishop here. After the third pair of moves listed above, white's recapture king takes rook, which opens the h-file, followed by a fresh check from black's rook on h8, white's king is prevented from escaping to g3 only by the knight on e2, which seals off the square. And you never have to worry that anything will be interposed between your knight and the king. White to move. What is the best move? There is some sense of urgency here for white because black threatens to mate with rook moves to a1, efforts by white to prevent this with 1. Bishop moves to a2 don't help, since then black has 1. Our pawn from f8 moves to b8, check. 2. Bishop moves to b3, rook moves to a1, checkmate. After all. So take stock of white's own attacking resources, a bishop aimed at g8, but with its path blocked by a pawn on f7, a knight on f4, able to check the king next move on g6, a rook on the h-file, and another rook, which must not be overlooked, queued on the first rank and ready to move to the h-file once h1 becomes vacant. Once you are clear on these various sources of pressure, the germ of an idea suggests itself, a sacrifice to open the pawn cover in front of black's king, and then a mating attack with the pieces left over. Experiment with checks. Starting with 1. Rook takes at h7, check. Won't work, because after 1. King takes rook, 2. Rook moves to h1, check. King moves to g8, white has a heavy piece he can drop onto h8 but no complementary piece that can add pressure on g8, his bishop doesn't have an open line, and he can't give check with his knight because the knight and black's king are then on different colored squares. So white turns to his other check as a possible beginning, one knight moves to g6, check. The pawn on h7 is pinned, so black has two choices of reply, playing pawn from f7 takes knight or moving his king to g8. Analyze both. A. If black plays pawn from f7 takes knight, he opens a line for white's bishop to g8. This is the signature idea of Greco's mate, so white looks to the h-file and finds that he can mate there with 2. Rook takes at h7, check. King takes rook, 3. Rook moves to h1, checkmate. Remember that after black's original reply pawn from f7 takes knight, he leaves a doubled pawn on g6, this is what prevents the king from escaping to g6 in reply to white's last move. B. Now suppose black replies to knight moves to g6, check. By moving his king to g8. This time a different signature move is available, 2 knight moves to e7, check. The classic prelude to Anastasia's mate. This forces the king back to h8, and now it is just a matter of creating an attack on the h-file, 2 rook takes at h7, check. King takes rook, 3. Rook moves to h1, checkmate. This time g6 is sealed off as a flight square by white's knight, rather than by black's own pawn as in the first variation.